Thank you. I think I got tapped to be vaguely moderator because I'm old, or something like that. Ken and Andrew have wonderful current books out right this minute, which you should all go buy one of immediately when this is all over. Mine is not so new. It's about 2 years old, and it's not even with my pictures. It's with Bernice Abbott's pictures, but it's sort of fun because it is her take on the city in 1929 and 30. When she was just using a little camera. Everybody thinks of her as using a great big camera. This was her snapshot. These were her sketches for what later became Changing New York. But the point is that the streets of New York City and the sidewalks and the buildings alongside the streets and sidewalks are lined with photographic gold, and these two guys have been grabbing a lot of that gold for a bunch of years. And I think it might be really nice if Ken and Andrew told a little bit about what they've been doing, what they tried to do with their books, and I'll tell a little bit about this later. And then we'll throw it open to questions to see what you guys might like to know about what we're doing. Tell us a little bit about how you put the thing together and your background.
My background is I'm a native New Yorker. I was born on. We lived in Brooklyn. Grew up. First few years of my life, we lived on a dirt road in Brooklyn when there were such things, and moved to Queens, and then there was. For a few years, for a few of my teenage years, I lived in the suburbs. But I applied to art school as a painter, and I got into Cooper Union, and I actually moved to this neighborhood when I was 17. As soon as I got out of high school, I just bolted and came down here, and I moved in with some friends from high school, and one of them was studying cultural anthropology at. He took a semester off and came to New York City to watch film, and he had gotten a job at the Strand bookstore. So we got a place on 12th Street here, and so that was my first beginnings here. He got me a job here. This is really kind of a homecoming for me because I used to work here 35 years ago. So I think it's just really great that I get to come back here in different guise. And it really hasn't changed in so many. It's changed in a lot of ways, but it hasn't changed in a lot of ways, which is really nice. But when I initially came here, I was studying painting, and I'd been getting increasingly frustrated with the craft of painting, and also just being confronted with everything in this neighborhood and living here. I felt like being in a studio and confronting a canvas really wasn't doing it for me. And Cooper Union had like a mandatory, you have to take a photography class, and I'd never taken pictures before in my life, and I just fell in love with it, and it solved so many problems I was having with painting at the time, and it brought me into the world, which for me was exciting and daunting. As you know, I moved here when I was 17, in my early 20s. This whole neighborhood was exploding with so much, so much. So, and growing up in New York and being the youngest of 4 sons, and also my father grew up in New York, I had all these images of what New York was, and also through mass media what New York was, and I found that none of my experience was really being reflected in the things that I was seeing and experiencing. Even walking, living south of 14th Street, there was this whole other world north of 14th Street that didn't seem to be aware of what this New York was that I was experiencing, and I just felt like I needed to explore it. I was both scared of it and enticed by it, and the camera was a way for me to get into the world and explore my idea of what this place was all about. So that was the impetus to do Invisible City, and that's also, you know, having the literary background of the Strand and loving Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities also gave me the inspiration for the name. So.
Well, the 70s and 80s, and even early into the 90s, it was the most exciting neighborhood in the world, right here, and you captured an awful lot of it, and you captured an awful lot of it. Some of yours was down here, and so Andrew, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to. He's all of a sudden become the world's greatest sports photographer.
All right. Well, could you hear me without this thing?
They're saying no in the back.
But the camera, the audio,
Oh. Is this on?
is I'm on.
Like Johnny Carson. All right. Well, I moved to New York in the mid to late 70s. I had studied landscape architecture, went to Rutgers, and I worked in a couple of firms in Boston. And I did that for about 5 years. And then I just kind of figured I needed to change, so I moved to New York. This would have been 75, 76. I went to Hunter for about a year and a half, and I dropped out. It was in painting, sculpture, fine MFA. And I had this idea I'd like to become a photographer. And at first I wanted to just do like newspaper stuff. And I remember going into the Daily News and showing the guy my portfolio. And he said, he was the editor, and he said, I wouldn't show this to anybody else if I were you. And then I talked to another photographer, I think it was Danny Farrell, who was actually quite famous in some circles. And he suggested I get a scanner. And I said, what's a scanner? And a scanner is a thing that picks up police calls, so you could listen to spot news stuff. And that was pretty much the start. So I remember at the time I was living in Chinatown with some dancers in a loft. I had a shelf in a loft. And I would go out at night with this scanner, and I wasn't quite sure what any of this stuff meant. There was all this like codes, and it was constantly spinning around. And so that's how I started. And I did this for maybe eventually 15 years straight. And I ended up doing construction work to support myself. And I was pretty systematic. I would go out maybe 3 nights a week at least. And the other nights I would print what I had. And I didn't get any real work as a photographer until really the early 90s. So and that's how this book came about. The date is from 80 to 95, which I think was a fairly seminal point in time in New York. Certainly not the mid 90s, I think, was the cutoff. And eventually I got a job at the Daily News, oddly enough. I got hired in the 93, and I'm still working for the Daily News. And I am shooting the World Series. I'm not sure if I'm going to Kansas City or Toronto. I'll find out. All right, so that's it. That's my life.
And you'll be in New York.
There's a couple of kids, by the way, that are here, and a wife, but we'll let that go.
I got to New York in 1967. In a funny way, the Central Intelligence Agency for whom I worked sent me here. And I did a lot of different things and met Bernice Abbott in 1972, the same year I built my recording studio. And that's when I more or less started taking pictures. And have continued ever since. Worked with Bernice for 19 years, and the reason I'm kind of here talking about the Steidl books that we did, Gerhard has done 8 books of Bernice's pictures, and one of them has to do with her early stuff in New York City, which was quite an interesting assignment because it was the reason she came back from Paris. Bernice was going to stay in Paris and be a portrait photographer, she thought, forever. Came back to New York City for a quick visit for something. Had left in 1921 because she just wasn't making it here, really. And fell in love with the city all over again, sold all of her belongings, traded all of her furniture for 6 Max Ernst paintings. Max got the furniture, she got the paintings. She came back, moved into the Hotel des Artistes, set up her studio and was going to continue it just like she had in Paris. And about 10 minutes later, the market crashed and she didn't get a portrait assignment for about 100 years. But she had bought a small camera and she decided she was going to go out and document the city. And interestingly enough, there is one picture that she took that would appeal to you. It was on 53rd Street, but done with an 8x10 instead of the little camera. She walked out of her apartment one morning and found a dead man sitting on her stoop, covered up in a sheet. So she went up and got her camera and took her, and she just captioned it "dead person," and that's the only one that would sort of be like that. But in any event, it was wonderful to put this book together for Steidl of pictures that were largely unknown by Bernice. It's interesting to compare what she was doing to what Walker Evans was doing, to what Ralph Steiner was doing, all about at the same time, because they were all basically doing about the same thing, because the subject matter was all out there, and they were that's what they were up to.
Did she know Walker?
Oh yeah, they were very good friends. As a matter of fact, there's a new Evans book out that has. Evans took probably about half a dozen portraits of her. They were good friends. She always, and if you follow photo markets and things like that, many of Evans's earlier prints from the 30s and stuff are the vintage ones that everybody wants so bad, or turning brown and stuff. And Bernice would see these kind of things, and she says, "God damn it, he never kept them in the stock bath long enough. He never fixed them long enough." But no, he did a series of wonderful portraits. Evans was different from Abbott from that standpoint, in that Bernice was so desperately poor. I mean, desperately poor. She would never take a picture unless somebody paid for it. Except for one person, she didn't charge Atjay. Thank goodness. But she used to complain bitterly about all the people she missed. The one she complained the worst about was Hart Crane, that she didn't photograph him because he couldn't pay for it, because she was too poor to do it otherwise. But her early New York City stuff on the streets was a precursor for what she did in Changing New York. They were sketches. She got her first big camera for the city in 1931, and took her 4 years to get funding to do it. Finally got the funding, did it till 39. But she was not, she continued using a small camera occasionally. And when she did it, she was pretty good with it, catching action and stuff. But that's not what she really wanted to do. She wanted to capture the city with the large format camera. But enough about that. It's an interesting thing. It's unfortunately for everybody here, this is one of a 5-volume set, and it doesn't, the New York one, you can't get it separately. Maybe Gerhardt will someday break it up, but as it is now, it's five books in one. So, but that's, about Ken, you know about Andrew, you know a little bit about me. Why don't we throw it open to questions about something you might like to know about pictures or whatever?
Who's the moderator?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I am. Lately I've been taking pictures of clouds.
It's Stieglitz right here, or you call them equivalents.
It's a funny thing. I've been going through this whole journey, I feel, with photography, and right now I feel I don't want to. I don't feel like. I guess photography for me has always been about asking questions, and also about being in the world. And I started thinking, and I started thinking about the chaotic nature of life these days. And then I also started thinking about the chaotic systems of clouds and the beauty of clouds, and started becoming fascinated with that, and was actually kind of surprised when I was seeing some things that I was getting from it. So it's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I think it makes sense for me because I feel like I'm still using the camera to ask questions, and to use it as a point of, in a way, meditation on my relationship to the world. I'm still interested in people, but I'm not photographing them as much. I'm printing, yeah, but I'm printing digitally now. The clouds are really nice big, I have to say. Well, I've been doing like 24 by 37, but I feel like they can get even bigger. We'll have to see. I've just started doing it, and I'm experimenting with it, and it's something I could do just looking up. And it's a funny thing because also I feel like there's also this sense that the things that you only get glimpses of become fascinating. I have children, and they're really interested in wildlife. And I think growing up in New York, because it was something that's other, that they can only get little glimpses of, they become more fascinated. And living in New York, because we're surrounded by these big structures all the time, the skies are, these little slivers. And yeah, so.
I have a question. One thing that you might not know looking at Ken's books, he's done many wonderful CD covers and things of music very similar to what the track here. Have you been doing any more covers?
Not really recently. The music industry collapsed,
Yeah.
and they really don't have the budgets anymore, and they got too embarrassed asking me to
Do it for nothing.
do it for nothing, and they got
Or a box of records.
Yeah, they got younger people to do it for nothing. So, but I made a good living with that for a while.
Yeah, well, you did some marvelous covers. I mean,
Yeah.
you should check his website.
Yeah,
And look at
like Alicia Keys was probably one of the later ones that I did, and Rufus Wainwright and Rod Stewart. I mean, lots and lots.
Another question from back in the back.
Okay. I just didn't know if you wanted to talk about the genesis and the construction of the original Invisible City was with Twin Palms
Yeah,
and Jack Woody.
yeah,
And I know that Jack Woody made a great effort throughout the 80s, 90s to get things taken throughout Europe, I think.
yeah. Photogravure.
And he was going to Japan, and I think he found like the last
Yeah, Nippon Printing.
that was doing Europe. And then I thought about last night when we were Yarhard title, which you were talking about, and I read about this process and everything, combining the digital and the analog. Coming, actually with this little forest building complex, whatever it is, and you make it stay there,
We're locked in.
But you also have a private chef to cook for you while you're trapped. So it's really.
But I just wanted to talk about the differences in constructing the book back then.
Well, back then, okay.
Did you get together and work through the construction of the layout?
No, I did everything, and even for this I snuck. I snuck into the whole process. I mean, I could talk about that too with Gerhard, because Gerhard wanted to just do Invisible City. I guess I'll start with that, because to me that's kind of fun story. And he asked me if I wanted to change it in any way, and I felt like, here I am, almost twice as old as I was when I originally, because I did the book in my mid-20s in the 1980s. For me, as a 55-year-old, so many years later, to go back and start rethinking. And I feel like there's also a lot of books that get reprinted, that get rethought, and you sort of lose a little bit of the essence of the quality. And the thing about Invisible City for me was, I always felt it was like this little gem, and I didn't want to start adding pictures to it because it would change the rhythm of it, change the sequencing of it. But then I also knew that I had a lot of other pictures that people never saw before, because these pictures, people are only seeing them now for the first time this year. And they didn't fit into the mood that I wanted to create for Invisible City. When I made Invisible City, my landlord had abandoned the building. We had no heat or hot water. The winter I was editing the book. The building was at war. There was a welfare mother she had 3 kids, and she was a heroin addict, and she couldn't pay for her own supplies, so the heroin dealers were using her place as a drop point and also as a shooting gallery. So I made that book under very particular conditions, which is what I'm trying to say. And here I am 25 years later, for me to go back and rethink that, I didn't want to do that. But I also knew I had all this work that was more focused on the nightlife of what was going on back then. And I thought that would be interesting to re-explore that. So originally, when I approached Jack Woody, I'd already gone through a bunch of publishers. I didn't know Jack, and being in New York, I went through kind of like the New York publishing scene and got rejected a bunch of places. Aperture almost did it. But it sort of almost as a last guy, I went to the Strand, I went to the St. Mark's bookstore, and at that point there was a book that was published every year of small presses in the United States, and of course I couldn't afford to buy the book, so I opened the book and I found Jack Woody's address and wrote it down on my hand and hoped that nobody saw me, and then I just sent the project to him blind, and he said that he would never, subsequently he said that he's never, and he would never, and he has never again just picked up a book like that, which is, I guess, is the same story for Andrew with this book. But the condition that Jack Woody said to me, he said, "I'll print your book." Well, okay, I'm sitting in my apartment like 6 months later after I sent it to him. It's sweltering hot, it's the middle of the night, and I get a call from Jack Woody, and he's got a very low, deep voice, and he goes, "Hello, is this Ken Schles?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is Jack Woody." And I said, "Oh, hi." And he goes, "I love your book. It's so depressing. Can I publish it?" And I said, "Oh, sure." So that sort of started that. And the one condition he had was that we have to do it in photogravure. And I was like, "Oh, okay." And that was better than anything. I'd always loved his books, and I think my book kind of looked like a little like the books he was doing, but it was also, he had never done a book so small before. He was always doing these big coffee table books like George Platt Lines, and then when my book came out, it was the same year that Herb Ritz and Joel Peter Witkin had their books come out, and my book really just kind of, like they were getting all the press. I felt like they were getting really well known, and my book really went straight into the underground and sold out pretty much immediately too. And then for many years I would kind of needle him. I'd say, we really should do a reprint, because they were all the time. I mean, this is for 25 years people have been saying, when is this book coming out? When are you going to do a reprint? But then eventually the photogravure process disappeared. And then Jack was like, you know what? It wouldn't be the same. And I had approached Jack about a few years earlier about doing something for the 25th anniversary. And we talked about it, and we really realized it wasn't going to be the same thing. And then this whole thing with Steidl kind of was a whole other thing that happened a couple of years after these discussions, and it was through Howard Greenberg, because Howard and Gerhard do a lot of things together. And I met Howard Greenberg actually at the LA Photo Fair years ago, after I did a book called A New History of Photography. And after the fair was over, he was leaving, and I ran into him, and he said, "This fair was an absolute disaster. There was nothing here I liked except for this one book that you did, and it was worth flying out here to see this book." And it was a limited edition that I did with this new press called the White Press that Schaden in Germany had put together. And it started this little kind of ephemeral relationship. And I'd run into Howard, and one day out of the blue, he just said, that Gerhard comes over he uses his office up at the gallery. He's like, "I can't talk to him. I couldn't ever suggest anything to him, but I want to have your book over here and just have it sitting around when he because I know he's coming by. You should get a copy," because even Howard Greenberg didn't have a copy. At that point, it's still really hard to get copies. And so I got a copy up there, and Gerhard saw it, and he just looked at it. Howard called me up. He said, Gerhard looked at it, and he, it took maybe 20 seconds. He looked through it. He's like, "I'm printing this." So Gerhard just was like, he just took it, and he said, "It's going to run with it." And I was really, really happy, because Gerhard is the only printer in the world he's spent a lot of time developing a technique that approximates the photographer look, and it's very labor intensive. It's a 5-plate black and white process. It's a quadratone with a varnish plate, and to my eye, it's a little bit technically. I feel like it's still a little bit modern. The old photogravure, you would lose a lot of detail in the shadows, and the highlights could blow out. And so this, I feel like it has that kind of modern contemporary printing control, but I feel like it's as lush and as beautiful as the photogravure books. So the fact that Gerhard wanted to do it was amazing and wonderful, and I'm endlessly thankful, because I feel like a good part of the feel of both of these books is very much in this very tangible, dense, black, sooty, beautiful quality. I mean, when I sent the original dummy to Jack Woody, I'd made it with Xeroxes, and back then, I don't even say photocopies, I say Xeroxes, and back then they also had this kind of sooty feel to them, and I think the photogravure just really it matched the grittiness of the film. I mean, the film I was processing in my tenement kitchen, so there was a lot of technical, it had a lot of issues with being blown out, and so I don't know, all of it together, it sort of all feels like it matches the printing process, the mood of the pictures, and I feel like I was really lucky to get Jack Woody, and then 25 years later, really lucky to find Gerhard. So
there's an interesting story about, Andrew, how your book came about. Why don't you let them know? I mean, because it's truly unique. I mean, Gerhard gets 80 zillion submissions and never takes any of them, except this one.
Probably 4 years ago. I was reading a Times Magazine article about Gerhard, and I said, "Wow, this guy looks pretty cool." And so I had a box of photocopies of maybe 140 prints, and I sent them to Gerhard with a handwritten letter saying, "I thought this would be a good book. What do you think?" And so about a year and a half later, I get a call from Gerhard, and then the book started to happen. Little did I know that he never accepts anybody's submission unless he wants to do it himself, so I guess that was kind of unusual.
And you just sent in Xeroxes.
Yeah, but they were really good Xeroxes.
They were good Xeroxes.
No, they were quality photocopies.
Mine were not.
But I don't know if you know the process. You're somebody was talking about going. Were you here for Gerhardt's talk last night? Anybody? Well, what you do when you're doing a book with Gerhardt Steidl, you go to Germany, and he has a compound in
Steidelville.
Göttingen. How do you say it? Göttingen. And so you make this pilgrimage, and he has a nice apartment right next to his place, which is a 5-story publishing house, and it's pretty intense.
Ronnie Horn calls it a Christmas village because it's mostly like 18th century buildings. It's
older.
But so I show up the first time I get there, and I'm a little bit jet lagged, and I'm trying to figure out what's up, and then I find out Gerhardt's in fact in China when I get there. But that's kind of the way it is too. But it was very intense, and I actually went there twice. I think most guys go there, 3 times? That's what I've heard.
Twice,
Yeah.
once I hear some. I went twice.
Yeah, I went back again to work on the layout. Again, it was very intense. And there is a good chef, this guy Rudy.
Yeah, Rudy, we love Rudy.
He's a really cool guy. So you'll break for lunch, and you have lunch with everybody in the top floor. And
But it is exciting because you get to meet all the other artists that are
that are working
at the same time.
that happen to be there with you. So there's maybe an overlap of maybe 4 or 5 different projects that you see happening. And I think I pulled an all-nighter in that upstairs room because I just couldn't get the layout the way I wanted it. So I really was there until like 4 in the morning working on these little photocopies that he then gives you to make a book, to make the layout.
Well, I mean, it's not unusual to walk in and find somebody sleeping on the couch because, they're doing a signature and it'll take 3 hours to print a signature, and they're going to put up another one, and then they wake them up and come down and check the press to make sure everything is good. And if it's good, then they get to go back, and if somebody else is taking the couch, you sleep on the floor. It's a very interesting process. Questions? Yes.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not accepting your question.
It's a two-part question.
Oh, God.
The first one is, obviously...
Oh, wait a second.
Obviously, you're both a news photographer and an artiste. I'm wondering whether when you're taking photos that aren't specifically for the Daily News, whether you feel like a reluctant voyeur, I'm not talking about your sports pictures, obviously, or whether you feel like a bad boy because you're behind the scenes on all this horrendous stuff.
Is there a question here?
There is, yes. What you feel like, whether you feel, okay, that's a bad question. And the most important question is, what is the relationship between the captions or the titles of your photographs and the pieces themselves?
I know the answer to that.
Oh, okay.
When I told you before I went to this editor to show my stuff, and I figured that each picture needed a little explanation, and it was like this portfolio book you have where you slide your pictures in the sleeves. So I figured if I wasn't around to explain the picture, I'd write a little caption on the bottom of each print saying what's up. So if I wasn't there, he would have an idea what was up. And of course, this morphed in time, and I got to the point where I just liked writing a little bit. And the printing somehow is like a process. Maybe it goes back to the time when I was a landscape architect, because you had to be very careful about your printing for the architectural drawings. And I kind of somehow feel good printing. And I somehow feel good describing the print in a certain way that's usually kind of obscure. So it's not obvious, even with the caption. That's about as far as I could go with that. Yes, they're integral. That's it. That's the word, integral. Is that it? Yeah, I mean, we could pass the book around if anybody, I don't know, has anybody actually seen the book?
I have.
All right, well, here, pass this around so you guys could look at it. Maybe there's more books, I don't know.
About 50 of them back.
Yeah, why don't you just, could we just give them to the, yeah. You're free to take these home, they're free. No? Yeah.
I was going to say, I work at the Strand here, and I follow the photo books, and I think that your photos were the best surprise.
Oh, wait a second, just a second.
I was so happy
I think you have to say that, repeat that.
Oh, well, first of all, I was just so happy to see Ken Schles's books being printed, reprint, and then the new one. I didn't quite know about the new one. And I really wasn't even familiar with Invisible City. So because it was always so expensive, I never really got to thumb through it. But your book came in a couple months ago, and then I didn't think it would be that great. But
I'm sorry I didn't hear that.
but I think it's really nice. But I do want to ask you, inevitably people compare it to Ouija, perhaps?
Yeah.
Does that tick you off, or do you find it?
I wanted one thing I forgot to mention. The guy who wrote the I guess it's not the foreword, but it's Brendan Bernhardt really wrote a nice little essay describing. He hung with me for about a couple days back in the early '90s, and. I should give him a lot of credit because I thought he really got it down, and he's a really good writer. And so, Brendan, if you're out there somewhere, you really did a good job. What was that question? You
I just, when I saw your book, I mean, just the cover,
Yeah.
I immediately thought of Ouija,
yeah,
the crime photographer from the 40s and 50s who kept the scanner in his back, and I think he had a developing.
yeah, right.
And just anytime I see a crime photograph, I kind of go back to Ouija or something. And I just wondered how many people, if you had $1 for every time people mention Ouija, or do people ever bring that up?
Well, it's actually in that guy's piece that he wrote, if you want to read it. But the point is that, yeah, I definitely know his stuff, but it's not like I'm kind of like. If I had to say the two biggest influences on my photography, probably Mad Magazine is one. I'm serious, growing up as a kid, because you put your head in a certain place. Well, you'll know about Mad Magazine sooner or later. Maybe not. And then there's all right, Ouija, definitely. Yeah, and August Sander, too. And I think Sander, I relate to him in an odd way because he seemed compelled to categorize things, and he's very repetitive, and I think that's how I approach things. I'd like to kind of organize it, which I did in the book to some extent. Social organization. All right.
Questions? Yes.
So I'm kind of new to the genre of photography, and I've noticed that there's a lot of noise, doing work from years ago and what's happening around now, with Instagram, et cetera. It's kind of all over the place. I guess with your guys' experience, I want to see, how it's developed and running, advice
Okay, I'll repeat the question. Given the history of street photography and the proliferation of new media's influence on street photography, the proliferation of like Instagram and all these things, and the fact that there's just a lot of noise out there, you want to know
Well, I mean, I guess like how you guys do it, or
how do we view it?
about it.
Well, I feel like I think that the street, it's like you go out there and it's almost it's a bizarre thing, but it becomes almost a reflection of what you're, like I said, it's like you go out and you ask questions. There's definitely this reality that you're confronting, that you come up against, but it also leads you to places, and I think that's what my suggestion would be, is to follow where it's leading you and where you feel like it's encouraging you to go, and to go there and explore it. I think one of the problems with the idea of street photography is that it's almost become a convention, because now it's its own genre, and so a lot of people go out there trying to make street photography, and I think that's in a way all it's gonna do is get you into situations where you're trying to replicate something else, or you're listening to a lot. There's a lot of noise out there, and it starts to get to be confusing. I think what you need to do is go into the world, confront it, see what interests you and what bothers you and what compels you, and try to find the spark within yourself to answer that and to explore it further.
One of the smartest things that Bernice Abbott ever told me, and you might think about this within the context if you are going to work on the street, is, and she always used the word project as opposed to project. Always have a project. You don't just, she said, the stupidest thing in the world is to go out and take photographs willy-nilly. You have to have a project that everything, will lead to something. That was her mantra, and from my standpoint, as sort of an old fogey, it's kind of works. I mean, I kind of know how to use Instagram, but not very well.
The thing that I find difficult with digital photography is just to keep up with it. I mean, you could shoot hundreds of pictures without even realizing it. And so the editing it's almost like the Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of thing, the Disney where Mickey's taking the water. You can't keep up with all the images that you're shooting. And so, I mean, I'm still printing stuff from 30 years ago that I haven't even had a chance to look at. And so it seems like now it's much worse, and there's way too much stuff out there. So it's hard to edit your stuff and then maybe come up with some kind of idea what you're doing if you're just shooting a lot. So that's the problem I have with the latest technology. There's just too much of it, and it's hard to keep track of it.
Not exactly how this question is informed, but if you have been shooting on the street in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I assume you've been doing your own printing, you've been working in the darkroom and doing your own printing, if you in fact have done that, and have switched over to doing digital work, maybe having left the printing, the whole printing process, the whole silver printing process altogether, or if you're switching back and forth. But do you miss the steps or the ritual that one goes through when you go into the dark room and print your own stuff and make all of those really, really slow choices? All that everything that happens there. Or has that been replaced with something else, or is that something else that you know? Or is that something that you really dearly miss? Or don't you? Maybe you don't miss it.
Okay, well, I'll answer that question because I started out, that's how I started making a living. When I first graduated from school, I started working for Gilles Perez as his printer, and then eventually started working for other Magnum photographers, Elliot Irwit. And I printed hundreds of thousands of prints. I used to smoke heavily, and I'd go in the darkroom, turn up the music to 11, and I'd love watching it develop. And I had to give it up for health reasons. So I don't print in the darkroom anymore. At a certain point, I was also kind of, well, I do miss it. I miss the ritual of it. I miss there was something very special about being in the dark and alone, and you're really there with the material, and that's something I do miss, but I also like having my health back, and I think that's more important for me. Digital, it's like everything is done in front of the computer. There's so many different professions now. A writer, filmmaker, you name the profession, accountant. Everyone's sitting in front of these screens, and it's kind of deadening. And I think it's also, it's deadening to the world. I hear a lot of complaints from street photographers, like everyone's walking down the street almost, zombies attached to these screens. That's sort of getting on another tangent. But I have to say, printing digitally, which I did my last show at Howard Greenberg, I did all the prints myself. We were trying, Howard Greenberg, I think, his collectors really love silver prints. They love the fetish of it. But I think, honestly, if I'm going to compare the prints, and we did, I tried to go, we were hiring printers. I was working with some of the best printers in New York to make the work. And also because of the difficulty of my negatives from the conditions that I made them under, I was able to do more digitally and get them more to the point where I was happy with them. That's also true of the books. I think this new edition of Invisible City that I did with Gerhard, to me, it's a different quality. It's not the same thing. I mean, there's the aesthetic of like a Japanese vase maker, where having throwing a pot and having these imperfections, and you get that with the silver print. But I think people over-fetishize some of it. I think for me, by and large, contemporary materials yield better results, results that I'm happier with. And I'm a little wary of the fetishization of the silver materials.
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily talking about the finished product. I'm talking about the process.
The process.
When you are working with a negative, you get to know that negative so well.
Yeah.
You get to know that shot so well.
Yeah.
And it's like you're maneuvering.
You're dancing with it.
Constantly.
Yeah.
It's like the quote, the negative is the score, and the print is the performance.
Yeah.
Each time we do it, I just had maybe that was an Adams, but I lost it. Come again?
Weston.
They get which one.
Do you miss that performance? The performance of making.
Well, I mean, but that's different than the results, and I think the results, for me, are much more meaningful because that's where the people understand the picture. So, yeah, I can get into, I'm not going to say masturbating, but it's like you're in the dark room and you could be having this experience alone. I don't know, some masturbation came up to me, but I think the final result is, is the print, and I think the print to me is, is really where how you're trying to communicate your ideas, and for me that becomes more, that takes precedence over the indulgences of the involvement of making it. I mean, it is a wonderful thing, and I don't want to demean it that way, but I think ultimately it really is. I think the printing that Gerhard's doing now is so much better than the printing that was done years ago, and he's able to do so much with contemporary technology. And I think that's really that's my answer to you.
We're here. Good answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
I still print.
That was my next question. Really? And have you all along?
Yes. Not as much as I'd like to. I don't have the time, but what you just said is right on. And I particularly like to listen to the radio, and it's like this vibe, and have a glass of wine or beer. It's a real situation that you put yourself in.
It just seems like very, very different things when you're printing your prints, or whether you're taking your photo and getting a glass of
No, and the thing that's cool is that you could do maybe 10 prints and they're all going to be a little different, and with the computer it's like ding. So I would miss it, yes.
Well, I should say thank you. I'm getting the motion from the back that they're saying that we should jump off these chairs. So thank you very much for coming. And there's somebody is waving their hand in the back. Just
I'm sorry that it's over. Oh, here.
Everything.
This is not going to be good.
No, it will be. I was thinking of something bad, but well, Andrew and I are old friends from kindergarten, and we did cartoons together and this and that, and both of us were living on the Lower East Side during the 70s and 80s, and so a lot of these photographs I've just seen over time, the ones that are in the book. So, oh, I remember that one, But the photographs I'm really interested in and like are the ones that aren't in the book, and they're, for lack of a better word, they're domestic photographs of friends and his parents and in various other things. During our time of living in the city, during that period of turmoil, and these I love, and I hope in future we might get a book out of that. So,
I have ideas, Doug. I definitely have ideas. Oh, I might add that I'd like to do a trilogy every 15 years. No, that's what I told you.
Yeah. But these are the ones I cherish. I have them up in my house, But I'm a hard editor,
Well, we'll see. On that note.
thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.